Hello and welcome to Future Building. I'm Mathew Aitchison and I'm Professor at Monash University and CEO of Building 4.0 CRC. Future Building is proudly sponsored by Building 4.0 CRC. Katerra was the shining hope of many in the building industry as it promised to radically transform the industry as we knew it. Launched in 2015 and eventually attracting over $2 billion in venture funding, in June 2021, Katerra finally shut its doors. Personally, I first visited the company in Seattle in early 2017, and they had all the swagger and confidence of a new company that was setting out to change the world. So inevitably, the collapse of such a high-profile venture raises many questions. If not like Katerra, then how? And what, if anything, has the collapse done for confidence that we can innovate in the industry? Now, on these issues and more, I'd like to hear a little bit from our Building 4.0's partners.
Well, before the collapse, I thought that trying to be a turnkey building company with true vertical integration was extremely ambitious, and growing so fast and acquiring companies in a market that is historically resistant to change was going to be a big challenge.
Very early on, we had already serious concerns about the rapid growth of the organization. And not only the rapid growth from a spread regionally and then internationally, but from a way of actually acquiring other companies and integrating other companies within Katerra. And based on our very own experiences, integrating expertise and integrating other companies into an organization will take time.
There were a lot of red flags here, and I'm sure many contributing factors to the collapse. They included, things like rotating cast of CEOs, a series of perpetual layoffs, factory problems and closures, some delivery failures, and certainly an accumulating capital pressure. And I think mostly and unfortunately the Katerra team was trying to do too much.
I had studied Katerra and their approach quite extensively. I found it quite fascinating, not just because of the amount of capital they had raised, but because they had people with experience of doing similar things in related industries. And so I think the ideas of better integration along the value chain are the key takeaways, and what we can learn from it is how better we can integrate amongst existing and new industry participants, not by trying to create one fully integrated participant.
As we've heard, our second conversation today tackles one of the biggest building industry news items of 2021, the spectacular collapse of Katerra. Joining me today to discuss these issues are Brian Potter, who is a former employee of Katerra and is now Structural Department Manager at DEVITA Inc. and author of Construction Physics, a blog which is well worth reading. Professor Jennifer Whyte, Head of the School of Project Management at the University of Sydney and Director of the John Grill Institute for Project Leadership. And finally, Daryl Patterson, Chief Product Officer and Head of Design at Lendlease Digital and Professor in Practice at Monash University. Welcome to you all. Now, for those listeners who are perhaps not as familiar with Katerra as we all might be, I wanted to start with an overview. Jennifer, who were Katerra and how did you become aware of them yourself?
Thanks, Mathew. I mean, Katerra were a startup, as you indicated, backed by Silicon Valley Venture Capital. And really, what was exciting and interesting about them was that they were seeking to gain market share and competitive advantage by using advanced technologies to vertically integrate and productize the whole value chain and workflow. I became aware of them as we were working with major construction companies in the UK. And they were interested in what this startup was doing, interested to know whether they would succeed given the regulated market and the deep sectoral knowledge that they felt they needed to navigate it, but also concerned that this startup might be the source of a disruptive innovation in the markets in which they operated.
Great. Thanks for that. Brian, as an ex-employee, it's possible for you, obviously, to to give us a bit of an insider's view. Your blog post, which is titled "Another Day in Katerra," which is a fantastic article. You point out that a lot has been written about the company, but that most didn't understand fundamentally what the business model was. Could I ask you to perhaps clarify that for us?
Sure. So the company originally started in its first incarnation was a sort of supply and logistics company more than a building company. The sort of business model was to, source materials and then from different locations, different manufacturers, sort of secure volume discounts in them, and then sell them to builders and contractors and architects for the buildings that they needed. That model basically didn't end up working. They were having a lot of trouble getting builders and architects to specify their products. And so what they did was they extended the model and said, okay, we will source our own materials from all these different manufacturers overseas and whatnot. But then we will also be the designer and the builder. We'll design all the buildings ourselves, and then we will put them up and just become a completely vertically integrated, much more vertically integrated than previous attempts. Construction, behemoth.
Interesting. Yes, because at the time that we first visited them, I think that jump had already been made to that vertically integrated model. There was certainly talk of the integration of the supply chain part, but I think they were probably in that mode of transitioning to be a full all phase of building delivery model. Daryl, you and I were there together actually at that 2017 meeting. I wonder if I could ask you to speak about what you saw back then as the promise that Katerra were offering, or what did you think the vision was?
I think the vision was very compelling in those early conversations. The idea that you could bring the best of manufacturing and use technology to ensure that those manufacturing opportunities were embedded in the design was something that was very compelling. The vision, though, started to become a little bit less clear with some of what we were hearing about the procurement piece, and it seemed like there were a lot of things on the table that were being pursued, and that, I guess, starts to raise a few red flags that when you have a very broad agenda and you're trying to work across everything from, what's the manufacturing approach, what's the design technology, to how things are purchased and specified, are you going too wide? And that was the sort of, I guess, slightly discordant note that we came away from that session with.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I'd like to sort of get into now trying to understand a little more exactly what happened. To set the scene there, I guess anyone who's read any of the media will know that the company grew to a peak of around 8,500 employees. It had major bases spread out across the US and other parts of the world. The company famously was buying up factories in other parts of the supply chain. Brian, again, you've written extensively in your blog about why the company collapsed and what it was like to work there. But can I ask you to elaborate on what actually happened? For example, when did the decline start? How did it first present itself? And how long did it all take?
Sure. It's hard to pinpoint exactly when the decline started. You can, argue that, at the very early stages, it was sort of baked in by failing to do sufficient verification of the business model before they raised all their money and built all their factories. From the inside, from my perspective, it really became obvious in sort of late summer of 2019. That was the first of what would become many really big rounds of layoffs. There's a quote from a famous investing book called The Hard Thing About Hard Things, where an investor says that a startup that has a really significant round of layoffs is a startup that he would bet against every single time. And that sort of was running through my head when the sort of layoffs were first happening. So that was when it became very obvious for at least some of us who were working there that things were not going smoothly.
Yeah. I can, for any listeners out there, I love that book, The Hard Thing About Hard Things. It's one of my absolute favourites. So we'll definitely get that in the show notes too. Daryl, you and I over the years have spoken many times about this since we first visited back in 2017. Was your insight from the outside looking in the same as Brian's, or when did you become aware that things were starting to go south?
Not so much starting to go south, but certainly signs that there were some stormy waters ahead. We obviously have a lot of conversations with other people in the property industry, and people were calling us to ask about Katerra, and they were very interested, and they'd had all kinds of interesting presentations from Katerra. And some of these people had actually, in fact, invested small amounts of money with Katerra. And over the course of several of these conversations, which were probably late 2018, early 2019, they were essentially looking for confirmation of their decision that they wouldn't use Katerra for a project, despite receiving very compelling proposals. And to hear that coming from people who'd actually directly invested in the company, it suggested that the big issue here is confidence in a new entity delivering the very complex and very high risk and significant commercial scale of major projects. And I guess I reflected on that and I thought, gee, that really is a problem for our industry. We're just not prepared to take a chance with a new entrant. We're not prepared to take a lot of chances with new technology. We always want to be the third or fourth or fifth adopter of that, and no one's really interested in being the early adopter. And that for me was sort of confirmed much later by some of the things we saw that Brian was talking about when the direction of travel started to become about downsizing and shifting into more traditional firms.
Yeah. Jennifer, you're now with us here in Australia, but I would imagine when some of these things were happening, you were still back in the UK. I wanted to ask, firstly, how aware you and your European colleagues were of Katerra, and also if you were being asked perhaps in the same way that Daryl and certainly I was as well, and also what impact did this decline start to have on over in the UK?
Well, Mathew, I think the £2 billion investment, $2 billion investment in Katerra was hard to ignore. So we were watching what was going to happen with this company, and whether it was going to succeed in transforming the industry. Changing an industry can, of course, be a bit like shifting an oil tanker, and I was quite active in some of the government initiatives around transforming construction in the UK at the time. And so we were watching Katerra. We were interested to see if they would succeed in some of their ambitions. We did feel that their ambitions were significant, but then they had significant investment behind them. I think as it started to become clear that they were not going to succeed as a company, then there was interest in ensuring that people understood that the startup and its success is not about it's not a general comment on the need to transform the sector. So there is a need to transform the sector. I think Katerra is a good experiment in attempting to do that. Not every experiment at innovation is going to succeed commercially, but I think there are many lessons that people around the world can take out of this in their own transformation agendas.
Yeah, excellent. And we're going to get to some of those lessons a little later. But before we do get to those lessons, I think, and several of you have touched on this already, I think it is interesting for us to go through in some detail and try to understand and list out the reasons that it did happen, this collapse. In reading the various news articles that have come out since the collapse, there does appear to be some consensus, and I thank all of you for sending through some articles that touch on this. I think these issues would include an issue around rapid scaling and the fact that Katerra pushed into territories with vastly different standards or compatibility issues and the flexibility of their product issues. I think another factor that we can point to clearly is the sheer volume of capital expenditure that this approach of rapid scaling required. Also, a growth by acquisitions strategy was pointed to as a key issue, particularly because it failed to integrate the acquired companies. Another one has been touched on earlier here by Jennifer, which is the issue of vertical integration and this buying up of the supply chain. What are the merits of that? It's been fairly widely covered off. And also, finally, just some of the investment-related matters, such as blowback from the WeWork troubles, which was also funded by SoftBank. So I'd like to get inside some of these issues a little more, and also a couple of the others which I don't think have enjoyed as much coverage. Firstly, getting to an issue which is around the culture of Katerra and the culture of technology. It comes through a question of one of our industry partners, one of Daryl's colleagues, Karl-Heinz Weiss from Lendlease Digital.
Very often, if we challenged with a disruption, our immediate response is actually persistent. And I think the market has resisted, and the market is a market of, risk-averse enterprises. If we're looking at construction and real estate market, is very risk-averse. The technology sector is the opposite. It kind of takes a lot of risk. Now a technology player comes into challenging the construction and the real estate industry with a higher risk proposition. You have to build that level of trust in product, process, enterprise, longevity, etc., etc., etc. Culture of technology companies is different to the culture of construction and building companies and real estate companies. How much of a role has kind of in the collapse of Katerra played the different industries? So a technology coming in, disrupting another industry, technology industry versus construction industry. How much of contribution was driven by different industries?
Jennifer, do you see a cultural issue here with tech entering the building industry?
I mean, it's interesting, Mathew, because you're putting together people who've thought in bits and noughts and zeros, and people who've thought about building at scale, and that they're not necessarily the same skill sets. So I think there are potentially some cultural issues with digitizing, but on the other hand, I engage with many people across the industry that are really keen to use the latest technology and to learn what that is. I would say that the biggest difficulty is around these kind of integrative technologies, where the digital technologies or the transformations that you're trying to enact by using digital technologies require a rewiring of the whole industry system. And so it's often not within the purview of one firm, but it requires different parts of the industry to fundamentally work together in a different way or to have a different relationship with the regulatory bodies or the planners. And there you find that the kind of changes that you want to enact quickly using digital technologies can often bump up against slower forms of decision making.
Oh yes, certainly a response that I can get on board with. Daryl, you've had some exposure with West Coast tech culture through your work. Do you think this played a role?
Look, I've heard people make comments to that extent, that there's kind of a hubris that's associated with particularly Silicon Valley, that they can do anything with some software and with some capital. And maybe that is part of the issue here. I'm not sure it really is the big issue. And the three things you could sort of say about technologists intersecting with any industry is they'll be successful if they understand the domain really well. Now, Katerra should have been able to do that because it acquired a lot of really great people from industry. I think the second thing is, this industry, quite frankly, has an enormous amount of white space with regard to technology. Yes, it does use technology. There are some things that have been around a long time, like CAD and BIM, but it's still very uncharted waters. And so that means there's not a lot of known patterns and examples and pieces of tech, and particularly software that can be adapted for the purpose. So you're doing a lot of things for the first time, which is quite difficult. And the third thing, which Elon Musk has been quite outspoken about, software's one challenge, but when you want to integrate with physical products, that is a whole different order of magnitude. That what you can solve very rapidly in software, if that software has to relate to a completely new set of physical products to enable a building to be manufactured and assembled, you've bitten off a much bigger challenge, and that one's probably pretty easy to underestimate. So I think you combine those three factors, and maybe some of that hubris of the valley doesn't cut through.
Yeah. Look, it's really interesting. We, for listeners of the podcast, shortly you'll see another presentation come out in a discussion between Bill Rue, the CEO of Lendlease Digital, and also Jeff Immelt, the former CEO of General Electric. And both Bill and Jeff point directly to that third point that you raised, Daryl, which is about getting that balance right between digital and physical. And as you point out, much underestimated in innovation in construction, but insightfully mastered by companies like Tesla, who've been very good at doing this. So a really interesting one to keep our ears open for in the coming months.
I have a quick something I want to jump in there. I think we don't want to overestimate the amount that it's very easy because it raised so much venture capital from, a large venture capital firm, SoftBank, that invests a lot in software companies. It's very easy to tell a story about, it's just, Silicon Valley folks that, know software but don't know how to move. They know how to move bits around but not atoms around. But the CEO and the entire, initial leadership team all came from the electronics manufacturing world. And the goal was basically to adapt that model to the construction world. So of the stories that you can tell about Katerra, I'm not sure that it's a story of software people not understanding how hard it is to move bits around is one that really fits.
Yeah. No, great point. And I think the next topic for discussion here, which is around execution, I think picks up on some of those issues, Brian, and comes back to you. Firstly, a comment from Mathew Barbuto, one of our partners at Building 4.0 CRC, a company called Ynomia.
I don't think the failure of Katerra is a reflection on a failure of the concept. I think it's more an execution problem.
Brian, in your blog, you mentioned many aspects of difficulties with execution, and I'll just summarize some of them for listeners. You speak about slow product development, a lack of competitive costing when bidding, choosing expensive products from the get-go, lack of integration of acquisitions, as we've mentioned before, and so on. And on this point, Gavin Tonnet from Donovan Group, another partner within the CRC, comments,
I think mostly and unfortunately the Katerra team was trying to do too much, basically, versus addressing a couple of key low-hanging fruit opportunities really well. Achieving product market fit is the single most important task for any innovative startup.
Brian, I want to ask you about one particular problem, and that is this issue of the lack of product market fit. About this you wrote, and I'm quoting you here, in some ways this is a boring answer. The most likely thing to kill a startup, kill the startup, end of quote. Can I ask you to talk more about that?
Sure. So, I'm not a startup expert by any means, but from what I've read, a very, very common failure mode in startups is they have an idea that seems like it's working or it seems like it should work, and the business scales up to execute this idea, and then it turns out that your idea doesn't quite work the way you thought it does. It needs to be changed in some sort of fundamental way. And it's a much easier to change what your business does if you have a very small business than when you have a very large business. If you have hired, several hundred people that all have specific jobs, and now you need to change things up so you don't need half those jobs, but you need a whole bunch of new other jobs. That's very hard to do, especially if your business isn't working right and you don't have as much money coming in as you otherwise sort of anticipated you would. And that all gets 10 times harder when you have a business that is building physical things and moving atoms around in the real world. And if you've built a factory to build a bunch of specific products, and then it turns out that maybe your idea needed some tweaking, well, what are you supposed to do with this factory now? It puts you in a very tough spot. So that's kind of the sort of thought behind that.
Yeah, a really good point, and quite eloquently written as well, Brian. And it takes us back to the business model, if you like. Isaac Coonan, our industry lead from the CRC, has a comment.
It's quite a confronting business model to have when you're coming in to disrupt something, to point out the flaws, to tell them they're doing it wrong, and to say that you know all the answers, versus evolving an industry, having respect and admiration for the global construction industry, but acknowledging that there is a need for change. There is a need for evolution.
Daryl, notwithstanding Isaac's concern for the irreverence for the existing industry that perhaps Katerra showed in some of its communication stuff, was there anything wrong fundamentally with Katerra's business model?
Look, I would restate Jennifer's comment that there is fundamentally a need for this industry to change, but there is also in this industry an amazing, amount of capacity. There's some incredibly clever people, some amazing organisations doing great stuff. The problem is, how do you harness all of that? How do you bring it together? And I think the solution at Katerra was vertically integrated. Then you'll have control of it. You'll be able to direct instructions up and down through that integration. But what we know about that kind of M&A is it's very challenging. It does tend to overwhelm the goals of the business, just trying to mesh companies together. You get all the stories about, does the left hand know what the right hand is doing? And often no. And often you're bringing in the culture and legacy issues of the companies you're acquiring. So that may not be aligned to what you're trying to do. I think if there was one flaw in the business model, it was scaling so rapidly through that vertical integration, and then compounding that by going out through a lot of different geographies. And I just question whether you're going to unlock the real capacity that's sitting in the industry by acquiring people. There's other ways to do it. And it's not just about reverence and respect, because you do have to challenge a lot of the status quo. It is figuring out how to unlock this massive latent potential that sits in so much of the supply chain.
Yeah. Look, a related issue is that question of scale and the ambition that Katerra clearly had. Damien Crough of prefabAUS has a comment on this.
Growing so fast and acquiring companies in a market that is historically resistant to change was going to be a big challenge. Their ambition was part of what led to their downfall.
Jennifer, do you feel that this attitude towards a kind of total revolution of the industry was part of the problem, and how does that relate perhaps to what Daryl's just commented on?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's easy to have naive ambition in this regard. So I think it's, people within the construction sector understand that the construction sector needs to change. As my colleague Stuart Green would tell you, in the past, the construction industry is littered with attempts to transform the industry. So we've tried on a number of occasions to change it. Now these changes haven't always had the intended outcomes, but I do think that this is an industry that has not been static, that is actually always changing, and that there's real potential for positive change in the industry. I think that we have to be careful with translating models from other forms of manufacturing, or electronics and other areas of manufacturing, because of the regulated nature of this industry. So I think two things that are really important when we think about transforming construction are the relationship with the public sector, and the kind of planning and regulatory bodies that construction engages with, and then also with with society. So and in a sense they're connected. So it's a regulated industry, and for that reason there are some dynamics that are different from in other manufacturing industries.
Yeah, the regulatory environment is exactly one of those things, isn't it, Jennifer, that is perhaps not as, I hate to use the word, but sexy as other kind of development of product or new technologies, the introduction of AI and machine learning and all of these big technological advances that have been made. But the regulation is kind of the lead weight around the ankle of the industry.
Well, Mathew, could I maybe offer a little bit more to that? I think, yes, it's a regulated industry, but aviation's a regulated industry as well, a massively regulated industry. I think the challenge is that it's how it's regulated, and it's sometimes national, it's sometimes very local, and it's a hodgepodge all around each country and all around the world. So that's a fundamental challenge. But there's this bigger thing there that is, as you say, you can't easily transport some of these models from other industries, and that's the fact that we love doing bespoke design of buildings, and we have good reasons for doing bespoke design of buildings, and so you never find, or very rarely find, two the same. And if you're going to go through this process of starting with a new design for every project, then you're not going to get to the things that are so important for manufacturing, the scaling opportunities, the learning curve effects that Brian's been writing about in his blog, which is so important if you want to get to the kind of transformations that Katerra was imagining. If you're not tackling these design issues and this fragmented regulatory environment, then what you do at the production end really won't make any sense.
Yeah. Completely agree. Because it features so heavily in a lot of the literature, I do feel like we need to come back to this question of vertical integration. Again, from Damien Crough at prefabAUS, Damien comments.
Well, before the collapse, I thought that trying to be a turnkey building company with true vertical integration was extremely ambitious.
Question for you, Jennifer, but generally for everyone, I think, is where has Katerra left us in terms of ambitions to vertically integrate for companies who are trying to innovate? Has it shown us that we shouldn't attempt this, or has it shown us that if you have the means, by all means, attempt to vertically integrate? Jennifer, you first, and then maybe to the others.
Yeah, I mean, I think the strategies and the kind of advice that I would give to companies is very context dependent. I mean, with Daniel Hall and Jerker Lessing, we observed three approaches that companies were using. So a sort of relational project-based spin-off approach, a vertical integration approach, and what we were calling a sort of digital systems integration approach, where rather than bringing things in-house, you were trying to integrate that across the supply chain using technology. It may be a good strategy for an incumbent, but it really depends on its situation in the market. My doctoral student, Alexander Joe, has been tracking the strategies of firms in China, Hong Kong and Singapore as they modularise. And in some of those markets, there have been incumbent firms that have been dominant in the market, buying up other parts of the supply chain, vertically integrating to deliver modular outputs. But I think it's really highly dependent on these systemic factors, the regulatory system, the competences available in the value chain, the existing capabilities of the firm. And it's perhaps a hard strategy for a startup to pursue. You become very vulnerable to the business cycles that construction experiences.
Yeah, definitely. Daryl, Brian, any thoughts on the future of this kind of vertical integration?
Yeah, I think vertical integration is not necessarily the the way I would frame the issue. I mean, you see industries move back and forth between vertically integration and more modular, depending on sort of the structure of the product and its sort of rate of development, things like that. You see, Ford and the auto industry move from a very, very heavily, completely vertically integrated model to one that's much more modular, where they buy their parts from separate manufacturers, kind of like anything else. I think the way I think about it is in terms of what the relationship is between the sort of players when a building has come together, and it's not so much that it's vertically integrated or not vertically integrated, but those relationships tend to be very tenuous and very sort of short term, and you don't have that high level of coordination that allows, that might allow sort of manufacturing efficiencies to be possible.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. Look, Daryl, this might give you an opportunity to respond as well, but before we move on to the lessons part of all of this, I just wanted to I guess, draw a line under the why part of the Katerra collapse and ask you all if you think that the result that we have now was inevitable, or if there is something that could have been done to avoid this. Daryl, maybe start with you.
Oh, that's a really tough question. I think, there's people in the organisation that have been soul searching on all of that, and it's very tough because you just don't have access to all of the, all of the status of what was really happening. Was it inevitable? No, I don't think it was inevitable. I think there were probably moves that could have been made at different points in time, perhaps limiting the growth and controlling the focus on a few things would have been the answer. But as I say, it's impossible to know from external. I think there's one thing, though, that you haven't touched on yet that maybe was pretty important to the demise, and that was the sheer amount of capital that was available to them. And I've got to say, I was envious, but then you see what happens when you have too much capital. You lose focus, and you encourage a lot of things to happen that seem to suit your ambitions quite nicely, but may ultimately be a distraction. And I think what we've seen many, many times is the best innovation is born out of constraint, adversity, difficult conditions. This is what causes people to be very resourceful. And when you have extreme amounts of capital on tap, I think the resourcefulness may not have been present.
Thanks for that, Daryl. Jennifer, do you think this was inevitable, or could you think of one or two things that could have been changed perhaps to avoid this outcome?
Yeah, I mean, I think the expanding across geographies is hard because of the different regulatory environments in which the building industry is situated. And so I think that's perhaps one of the extensions of this model that could have been done more with more kind of care and caution, if you like. I do think that Katerra, it had the right ambition. So I do agree with the quote earlier that it was about the execution rather than the concept. So I think the idea that we need to in some sense integrate, and whether that's by bringing it all in-house or whether that's through interactions across the supply chain, we do need to integrate better across the various bits of construction. And I've been doing work with Judith Hackett in the UK in their review of the construction sector, and it's really been surprising and to some extent alarming, the lack of knowledge within the sector as to how the whole sector works and the responsibilities of different actors as players within that bigger picture of producing buildings that are fit for purpose, that meet the goals of clients, that are delightful to live in. And so we need those kinds of T-shaped people who can kind of connect deep expertise and across the supply chain. And I think, Katerra's approach was solving some real issues around things like design and manufacturing and their relationship. And so, I'm disappointed that it didn't succeed. I think there were some warning signals before we got to the final outcome.
Yeah, thanks. Brian, I know that this might be a really tricky question for you, but I do think it's of interest to so many other companies who are perhaps out there listening, and we will get on to the lessons, but I do wonder whether you saw it as inevitable at a certain point, and if there was any go-to lever that you felt should have been pulled in order to turn that tanker, as Jennifer described it, around.
Yeah, so I have a few thoughts on that. One is that, yeah, there were undoubtedly operational, perhaps missteps that in retrospect could have been done better. Another is that the sort of fundamental business proposition or proposition here, where you're trying to reach mass production scale of buildings and unlock the efficiencies that level of production entails. That's been, that's something that's been tried many different times in the building industry. It has not ever really been able to been cracked. And there's various reasons for that. Regulation is a big one. Just the sort of physical constraints of having to ship something so large ends up being a pretty important one. So I don't think Katerra had a fundamental new insight or anything that really changed that sort of fundamental calculus. They were kind of playing a playbook that many people had sort of played before. On the other hand, I don't think just because that initial idea wasn't necessarily one that could have worked doesn't mean the sort of failure was inevitable. I think they were in the process of pivoting away towards a more sustainable model. One thing that's, I think, important to keep in mind is that they had a lot of very bad luck. The coronavirus was pandemic was an obviously huge one, but there was a whole slew of other things. The sort of simultaneous collapse of WeWork really sort of influenced their trajectory as well, sort of put a lot of pressure on them to be more profitable earlier than maybe they had otherwise intended to be. And then which is also a SoftBank company, and then the collapse of another SoftBank company, Greensill Capital, which had funded some of their loans, which they had then sort of tried to back out of, ended up being the final nail in the coffin just a few months after they had sort of thought to have steadied the ship. So there was a lot of, if the dice rolls had come down a little bit differently, maybe this would have ended up looking more like WeWork, where their sort of initial scale and enthusiasm didn't play out, but then it eventually turns into something resembling a real business.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. That's really good to know. Thank you for that. I guess I would just state the obvious now as we move into some of the lessons we can learn, which is that we're all people who are committed to innovation in this sector, and we all do different things in our sector. But I think a lot of the audience will be wondering, what lessons do we take from all of this? Gavin Tonnet, again from Donovan Group, has a question directly to you, Brian, which I think touches on that it's not all doom and gloom. Gavin asks,
it's easy to get caught up in the failure analysis of Katerra. I'd like to know the successes of Katerra, even if they're small, and what we can all learn from those.
Brian, you closed your article, your blog post, I should say, on a very bright note, saying how most people really enjoyed their time at the company. Could you reflect on some of the successes of Katerra and Gavin's question?
Yeah, I think of just the early stages of just trying to figure out this productization and what it looks like, and trying to take a building, what is by all accounts a pretty standard, in some ways a very simple building. We had sort of a lot of engineers comment, who were working on one of the main products, the garden apartment building. It was like, I can't believe I've spent so many months and years of my life on a simple garden apartment building, which normally sort of goes in and out of a design firm, within a matter of weeks. Just that what it takes to kind of get that into a place where you have a real product, that was a really major lift and a very substantial effort. And I know the people that worked on that were really talented engineers and very proud of the work they did. And then the other kind of thing that I can think of is that this is a quote, it's probably apocryphal, attributed to Edison, where he talks about his many failures in trying to invent the light bulb, and he says he didn't fail, he just found 700 ways of doing it that didn't work. I think it is useful to just to sort of glean as much as we can out of the what they tried and what they tried not to do, because so often a business, especially one that's doing something innovative, if it just fails silently, it doesn't teach you anything at all. So I think it's, again, kind of like what we're doing here. I think just being able to sort of try to dissect it as much as we can and glean as much as we can, I think is really valuable for other folks.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. On to another lesson around, let's call it innovation and disruption. Damien Crough of prefabAUS again asks,
do you think technology and infrastructure is advanced enough to disrupt and solve construction?
Daryl, I'd like to put that one to you. Is the technology and our thinking mature enough to transform building? What can we learn from Katerra in this regard?
Yeah, well, that's a two-part question, and I think on the technology itself, it is just now mature enough. I think the cost of compute cycles is down to a point where you can do pretty amazing things. So the future of design automation, the production technologies that are now becoming quite prevalent in industry with digitally controlled machinery, it's here now. And of course, we're all sort of exploring what AI might contribute to these things as well. But the second part is the maturity, which is really a question on how people think and culture. And that's a much harder thing to answer. And I'm not sure that we're really there yet. And if you went back to your previous question, what were one of the things that was a success coming out of Katerra? They really upped the conversation about the need for change, the potential to change, the ways that change might happen. And for some of us who've been playing at the edges of this for a long time, they got that conversation to be pretty much mainstream in all of the construction businesses and design houses and suppliers, which is a great thing because people have woken up that there is the potential to bring some of these new technologies in to do things differently. But I'm not really sure we're quite there yet on the maturity to be able to really push on the business models of all the different actors involved to take it on.
Yeah, thanks, Daryl. I really appreciate that answer. We've got another comment from Damien Crough. We keep coming back to Damien. That's because he's got a lot of very good comments. And this one cuts to the lesson of change management.
The lessons are, if you want to reinvent construction, don't underestimate the change management component and the need to bring everyone on the journey. And the fact is, you can't own and control the whole supply chain. It's just too big and fragmented.
Jennifer, again, I guess a running theme about supply chain and vertical integration, but would you agree with Damien?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, the Katerra case raises this interesting question about how much can you do as a firm and how much do you have to foster innovation at a systems level, including the government and project sponsors. And certainly in the UK and in Singapore and other places that I've been involved in, there's been a lot of work in terms of fostering a kind of industry-wide conversation that includes government and project sponsors and tries to cascade that down then to kind of regional planners and those people who are sort of packaging out land for housing and so on. And I think, it comes back to that issue of the systemic problems in project-based industries and that they often cross the boundaries of firms. And so we've seen some of the firms that are innovating in this area really trying to kind of lobby and promote and create those connections to engage in that bigger change management piece that Damien's talking about.
Yeah, thank you. In terms of this recurring issue again of that you find in all of the pieces, and we've touched on it many times today as well around scaling, Mathew Barbuto of Ynomia comments.
The Katerra collapse has many lessons, and I think those lessons are mostly about the way that they tried to implement very lofty and ambitious goals. I think that if we deconstruct what happened with Katerra, it was a case of too fast and too hard.
Daryl, scale is such a vexed issue for new ventures in building. We've seen this time and again, and the case studies that we've reviewed over the years all point to this issue. But in light of Katerra's experiences, how should or could new companies scale appropriately?
Yeah, there's a couple of issues tangled up in this, I think. One is, clearly scale is something everyone's trying to figure out. You need to have, if you're interested in this idea of productization and a manufactured approach, that's going to need scale to drive it. And that's always been a challenge for this industry. It doesn't provide any kind of certainty around scale. And then, as I've said before, we're constantly changing what the product is. And so there's no scale to be had, you would think. I think if you're going to go into this, as many are trying, you've got to be very tactical and say, well, we're not going to go change the whole industry. We're not going to change every building type. We're not going to change every geography. But what we do need is to choose a building typology, which could be medium-rise residential dwellings, for example. We're going to do it in a significant geography where the conditions are good for it. We're going to see that the technology we evolved there could be exported eventually to other geographies and adapted eventually to other building typologies. And we're going to see if we can glue the whole value chain together around that one typology, meaning, as Jennifer was alluding to before, how do we get the design community interacting with the suppliers, interacting with the installers and assemblers, and the government, regulators and stakeholders involved in a way that we actually have a collective understanding of what we're trying to transition. So it's not about saying we're going to take on an entire market. It's about saying we're going to take on a very particular product within that market.
Yeah, I get that. And that's a very, we should distinguish that approach, I guess, if I'm understanding you correctly, Daryl, from what other startups might call the minimum viable product. This is slightly different what you're suggesting here, if I understand you correctly, because it's about making really clear choices and going through the full cycle with that choice in that particular asset class. Have I got the right end of the stick there?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the reality is one new model of the industry, such as it is evolving or could evolve, may not suit all markets anyway. So that's probably not a sensible ambition to hold. I really think we're trying to evolve some completely new solutions, which may be horses for courses, and we just need to find the right course.
Yeah. Look, I'm going to circle back to a point that Daryl raised before around constraints and come back to a learning, I guess, around finance and investment. And in some senses, it ties back to this discussion we're having here about scaling. Finance and investment, is it a blessing or is it a curse? And again, some comments from the CRC members. Isaac Coonan comments.
They received over $2 billion worth of investment from SoftBank.
Mathew Barbuto of Ynomia comments.
This industry is highly fragmented, and trying to be that vertically integrated at scale would require infinite sums, probably sums beyond the realm of any one organisation.
And Gavin Tonnet goes on to comment.
Rule number one, don't run out of money, but and certainly don't just keep loading it back in.
Brian, it was a well-capitalised venture. Would Katerra, do you think, have been better off if it had been forced to count every dollar or to grow within its means?
In some sense, I think that's true because, like we've talked about, they had many different irons in the fire. They were trying to develop many different products at the same time. In another way, I think, they could have used even more money, because I think if you're trying to really iterate and develop a product until you're sure that it's good, it's very hard to do that if your product is a $10 million apartment building, right? You can burn through $1 billion in product iteration very easily if you're building an entire building. I think that's kind of a fundamental challenge to this industry, is that it's hard to do the sort of iterative development that we sort of think is what results in a sort of successful innovation at the level of an entire building. It takes a huge amount of funding to do it.
Yeah. Look, Jennifer, I want to finish up this section of lessons around the inherent complexity of building and achieving what you've referred to as systemic change. Gavin Tonnet, again from our partner Donovan Group, comments.
Let's not underestimate construction and its complexity. The design, no two sites are the same, and that's the hard part about this. It's not like the automotive industry where the roads are the same, the environments are largely similar. Certainly within jurisdictions they're almost identical. That's not the case with construction, so you can't apply complete automotive type engineering to construction.
These are the things that are at play, and they're complex. So finding ways to allow efficiencies to flow through the supply chain whilst dealing with these complexities is important and certainly the key. So Jennifer, in chatting about this with you a few months ago, you did mention the issues attached with what you term systemic innovation, something that we in the CRC are also working on and towards. Could I ask you to elaborate how you see that?
Yeah, I mean, it's relatively easy for a firm to innovate things that are under its control. And so, in this is why I kind of push back on the idea that the sector is not innovative, because actually I think there's been a lot of innovation in construction in things like materials or windows or kind of units that are within the purview of one supplier. But what I think is really difficult and is really the area in which there's a need for innovation in construction is this systemic innovation. And in other industries, it's known as architectural innovation, but it's become known as systemic in construction because it doesn't have anything to do with architecture, particularly as a discipline, and because it's about the kind of innovation where multiple parties have to coordinate to make a change at a systemic level. And in that. Because that's the major challenge in construction, I would say a lot of the R&D and development goes on live projects that are being delivered in the market. So it's less about the R&D process of getting a perfect product before you get to market, and more about people iterating their products in the market. And I realise that opens doors and closes doors to different kinds of solutions. But that systemic innovation is really the challenge that things like the UK government initiative was trying to address. So it was trying to have an industry level conversation about how do we address some of these challenges that are not possible for a single firm to go off and just innovate and come back with a solution to. And I think things like net zero are really going to make that collaboration at an industry level even more important, to be able to get to solutions that are appropriate and not to prejudge, in a sense, what those solutions will be, what those outcomes will be.
Yeah, thank you, Jennifer. I'd like to move to wrap up now, and we'll close with a comment from Isaac and get some responses from the panel. Isaac Coonan comments,
my views on Katerra was excitement and hope. I could see that the property and construction industry around the world was ready to engage in a conversation around new principles and methods to ensure the longevity of this industry. I was excited to see what was potential for property and construction globally.
Daryl, a question for you is, do you think this will discredit other innovation attempts?
Oh, no. In fact, quite the opposite. I think this is a stimulant right? I think they changed the conversation, as I said, around the potential for productization and manufacturing. They woke the tech sector up to the fact that this is a white space that they could add a lot of value to. They drove particular things around cross-laminated timber and its adoption in the US market. But I think, if anything, it's just whet the appetite of a lot of other thinkers in the space to say, yeah, we can see what they were doing, we can see some missteps, we maybe would do it differently. In no way does this discredit other innovation attempts.
Okay, thanks. Jennifer, how important is optimism for you in building innovation?
I mean, I would agree with Daryl that this has really whet the appetite of people going forward. But I think sort of guarded optimism is important in this industry. So I mean, I say that having been involved with Judith Hackett on the post Grenfell sort of review of the UK construction industry, and I think we have to innovate, but we also have to be aware of the responsibilities that we have as constructors, and so it's not unguarded optimism, but I think a positive approach to problem solving is really important. We all know that there are issues in the industry. Over-optimism is not helpful, but a positive approach is really helpful. And, I've spent some time on the west coast of the US. I was a visiting professor over in Stanford. And, one of the things that's great there is that there is this kind of can-do attitude, this kind of, there's a big problem here, how do we go away and solve it attitude that sometimes you don't experience in other places. People are, it's too complicated or it's difficult and you're never going to be able to, and I think in that way optimism is really important, but we have to also recognise our responsibilities in driving that forward to fruition. And I think as we move into kind of challenges around post-COVID, net zero, there's a lot of opportunities for innovation in this industry, and they may be about reusing, repairing and repurposing buildings as well as delivering new buildings in a better way.
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer. Brian, I'd like to finish with you and ask you a question that you do touch on in your blog as well. But what do you think you'll remember about your time at Katerra?
Oh, just definitely the just amazing team of people that I had a chance to work with. The engineers in the Atlanta office especially, but just everybody on the engineering team, everybody that was working to develop this product was, again, just such an amazingly strong, talented group of people that I feel very lucky that I had the chance to work with.
Yeah, wonderful. Thanks, Brian. Look, I think that's a really good spot to finish up. I'd like to thank our panelists, Brian Potter, Professor Jennifer Whyte, and Daryl Patterson. I'd also like to thank the very many members of Building 4.0 CRC for your questions and insightful comments. And I'd also like to thank you, the audience, for joining us again, and say thank you and until next time.